This week we're focusing on Romans chapter 10, verse 4, with the purpose being to answer the question, to what end? So before we get to verse 4, let's start out with verses 1 and 2. All of our readings today are from the ESV in English and from the UBS 5 in Koine. So let's take a look at verses 1 and 2. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. So, who is this them of which Paul speaks? He's writing about the Jews to Christian believers in Rome. And we know this because if we go back and read chapter 9, it's all about the relationship between Judaism and this nascent Christianity, and how Christianity is a fulfillment of Jewish tradition, etc., and history, and how they are to be incorporated together into the whole here. So if you want to read that, take the time, hit pause, go back and read chapter 9. But here in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, Paul is talking about his desire to see the Jews who have not yet accepted Christ come to faith and salvation. Let's carry on with verse 3. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own what? Their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So the issue at hand here is righteousness. And what's at controversy? The controversy is the struggle between a righteousness that comes from God and a righteousness that is one's own. And what we're told is that because they're ignorant of God's righteousness, ignorant is a bad word today, and we use it as an insult, but ignorant literally just means not knowing. So if you don't know that righteousness from God is available to you through faith in Christ and what he's done with his sinless, perfect life, his sacrificial and atoning death, his resurrection that grants new life, etc., etc., if you don't know that, you wouldn't lean into that. Instead, as it says in verse 3, you might seek to establish your own righteousness through right living, and as a result, not submit to the righteousness that God is offering in Christ. That's the conundrum. That's the controversy over this righteousness that Paul is writing about. He wants people to be saved through faith in Christ and his offering on their behalf, but they don't know about it. What they know is that they're supposed to present themselves as righteous through right living, through obedience to the law, and therefore they're not taking advantage of the righteousness that is being offered to them through faith in Christ. Not because they're bad people, but because they don't understand it, literally being ignorant, not knowing that that's what God is offering in Christ. And that brings us to today's verse 4, which says, For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So let's pick this apart in Koine. Telos gar nomu Christos eis dikaiosune panti to pistuanti. So the first thing we need to look at is gar, the second word in there, for. Whenever we see that, we know we don't have an independent thought here. This is connected to what came before. It's a linguistic signal that this verse, this sentence, is tied to the one that preceded it. And what do we get next? Telos, and then we go to the fourth word, Christos. And if we look at these two words, they both end in omicron sigma. They're both in the nominative case, they're both masculine, and they're both singular. So the nominative case dictates the subject. Here, Christ is the subject, and telos is a predicate. So we have a predicate nominative a subject and a predicate, both in the nominative case, and we have to supply the is in the middle. So we had gar, for Christ, subject, is telos, the end. So telos can mean the purpose, the fulfillment, like the goal or the cessation of something. And it doesn't have to just be one of them. It can be more than one of them. And here we're told that Christ is the end. The end of what? The end in what regard? And then we get our third word in the sentence, namu. Namu is from namos. Here it's in the genitive case, genitive masculine singular, and it is of the law. Christ is the end of the law. So Christ there then is the purpose, the fulfillment, or the cessation of the law. Maybe all three, maybe two of the three, maybe one of the three. The interpretation is going to have to come from you and me as we flesh it out in wholeness. So the next two words, eis dikaiosune. Eis is the preposition into, unto, or for. And here, dikaiosune, righteousness, is in the accusative case. It is, and we're talking about the purpose, the result, or the means of something. That's what the eis is signaling. So Christ is the end of the law. In what regard? For the purpose, or the result, or the as the means of righteousness. So here we have the contrast to verse 3. There's a righteousness from God being offered, but the Jews are seeking to establish their own righteousness by righteous living, by keeping the law, and as a result are not submitting to the righteousness that comes from God through faith in Christ. Here we're told that Christ is the fulfillment and or cessation of the law. In what regard? In regard to granting righteousness as the means of righteousness versus the law as the means of righteousness. And then we're told for whom this is the case, panti to pistuanti, for everyone who continually believes. Pistuanti is a present active participle. In the dative case, panti, to, pistuanti are all in the dative. To or for everyone who believes. So continual belief in Christ, who is the end of the law unto righteousness, introduces the notion here of righteousness by faith in Christ versus righteousness by right living through keeping of the law. So we get this huge irony here. Let's go back and read verse 3 again and look at this enormous irony. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So what's their goal? Their goal is righteousness. They're striving, they're seeking to establish their righteousness by the meticulous and perfect keeping of the law, to which earlier in this letter Paul tells us there's no difference. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The very best among us have failed in establishing their righteousness through law keeping. The only one to ever perfectly keep the law is Christ. That's what he tells us thoroughly through the book of Romans. Now here in chapter 10, verse 3, he talks about this irony. They're striving to establish righteousness, but they don't understand the righteousness that comes from God in Christ, and as a result, they won't yield to it, they won't submit to it, they won't accept that righteousness. Instead, they keep striving for their own. Think about it this way for a moment. Let's replace the word righteousness with cake. I'm pretty predictable, aren't I? I'm back to cake. So we're taking the word righteousness and replacing it with cake. They're striving for cake. They want cake, not just cake, they want perfect cake. And they're working feverishly at making perfect cake. And God comes along and says, I have perfect cake ready for you if you will accept it. Just accept that this perfect cake in Christ exists. It's available to you. I don't want you to prove anything to me. I just want you to accept this perfect cake. It's ready. Just have it now. And they say, I can't hear that. I'm too busy working on my perfect cake. My cake is not perfect. My cake keeps falling. My cake tastes salty. My cake is cracking in the middle. My cake keeps getting dropped on the floor. My cake has manure in it. My cake is no stinking good. But give me time. I'm trying. I'm going to get to the perfect cake. And as a result, they won't accept the already made perfect cake that's available because they don't understand that they can just have the cake. I thought your goal was cake. Yes, my goal is cake. Not just cake, but perfect cake. Well, there's perfect cake available. I don't have time for that. I'm working on my cake. You see the irony? You see what's happening here? So Paul says, in their ignorance, they won't accept the cake that's already made, the righteousness of God, made perfect and made available to them in Christ, because they're trying to establish their own righteousness. They're trying to make their own perfect cake, and as such, they can't submit to the righteousness of God that's available to them. I can't take your perfect cake because I'm too busy trying to make a perfect cake that I'll never, ever make on my own. Grave and gross irony in it. What do they need to do? He tells us in verse 4. He tells us that there's righteousness available. How so? Through Christ, who is the end of the law. Telos namu, and the end of the law. Eis dikaiosune, unto righteousness, for the purpose of righteousness, as the means of righteousness. Then we get panti to pistuanti, to everyone who continually believes. If you believe in the Christ who is already perfect, who is perfect in his righteousness on your behalf, you will have the thing that you're striving for. Stop the striving. You can't make a perfect cake, but there's a perfect cake already available to you. There's perfect righteousness available to you if you will accept it by faith. But if you insist on establishing your own, you're not even going to hear the offer that's being made. That's what Paul says here in the first 4 verses of Romans 10, which is a direct consequence of what he says in chapter 9. So look at the great irony in it. You want cake, but you won't accept cake because you can't see that the cake is available. Why can't you see it? Because you're too focused on your crappy cake that you insist on baking on your own. That's the irony. To what end? I said we would be looking at the question, to what end does Christ come? Christ comes to bring an end to your striving and offer you a righteousness that is already complete and whole and perfect that you can't accomplish. If you managed perfect law keeping today, it in no way undoes the imperfect law keeping of yesterday. So if your goal is righteousness, if you want that perfect cake, you're going to have to attain it by faith in the one who is the end of the law. Telos namu, the end of the law. Eis dikaiosune, unto righteousness. Panti to pistuanti, for everyone who believes. Believing in him gives you access to the fully baked, perfect dikaiosune, righteousness that you're striving for. And the striving is the thing that's keeping you from the goal. To what end? If you want righteousness, accept righteousness. But if you keep trying to bake this perfect cake, you're never going to get there. Wow, big stuff in that verse 4, especially when we put it together with what we saw in verse 3. The irony here is it's the striving that's keeping you from the thing that you wanted in the first place. Hope that was good for you. You know what to do if it was, with the liking and the sharing and the subscribing. Leave me some feedback in the comments. And I bet if you take a careful inventory, to use some 12-step language, a fearless moral inventory, you'll understand that even at your best, your cake's not that great. And if your goal is a perfect cake, there is one available, but it's not of your baking. Look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, Karis Kai Irene Humi, grace and peace to you.